Machiavelli's most dangerous insight wasn't about power, politics, or war. It was about kindness and why he considered it the most destructive trait a person could possess in human society. In his political and personal observations, Machiavelli documented what he called the kindness trap. Individuals whose natural compassion and generosity made them perfect targets for exploitation, manipulation, and systematic destruction by those who understood how to weaponize goodness against the good. These kind-hearted people believed that treating others with compassion would inspire reciprocal kindness, but Machiavelli discovered something terrifying. Their very kindness attracted predators who saw goodness as weakness, to be exploited rather than virtue to be honored. Machiavelli called this insight dangerous because kind people weren't just failing in competitive environments, they were being systematically destroyed by their own virtue. Their compassion was weaponized against them. Their generosity was exploited until they had nothing left to give, and their trust was violated so repeatedly that they either became broken shells of their former selves or transformed into something harder and more calculating than their original exploiters. Not because kindness was inherently wrong, but because in a world full of calculating individuals, unguarded virtue became the most dangerous liability a person could carry. Today, I'll reveal Machiavelli's most dangerous insight about why kindness breaks people and why he believed that understanding this law either destroys your faith in human nature completely or transforms you into someone capable of protecting goodness while navigating a world designed to exploit it. Before we continue exploring this revolutionary discovery, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our deep psychology content. Leave your like to support the work and comment which aspect of this topic resonates most with you. Now let's dive into the discovery that changed everything. The case that revealed Machiavelli's most dangerous insight began with his observation of what he described in his private letters as the good man's inevitable destruction. During his years of political service in Florence, Machiavelli witnessed countless individuals whose natural kindness and moral integrity led not to success and happiness, but to systematic exploitation and eventual ruin. But Machiavelli quickly realized he wasn't observing random bad luck or coincidental misfortune. He was witnessing something far more systematic and predictable. Machiavelli wrote, "I have observed with great consistency that men of good character who approach others with genuine kindness and trust suffer not occasional misfortune, but systematic destruction at the hands of those who recognize virtue as opportunity for exploitation." This pattern wasn't limited to politics. Machiavelli saw it in business relationships, friendships, family dynamics, and romantic partnerships. These kind individuals would consistently attract people who needed help, support, or resources. They would give generously of their time, energy, money, and emotional investment, believing that their kindness would inspire gratitude and reciprocal care.
The good man
But
finds himself
Machiavelli
punished for his
observed
goodness
that
and
instead of
blamed for the
creating
selfishness
mutual
of others.
goodwill, their generosity attracted increasingly demanding and exploitative individuals who saw kindness as weakness and compassion as invitation for manipulation. Most devastatingly, when these kind people finally recognized they were being exploited and attempted to establish boundaries or protect themselves, they would be accused of being cruel, selfish, or betraying the very people who had been systematically draining them. Machiavelli wrote, "The good man finds himself punished for his goodness and blamed for the selfishness of others who have learned to weaponize his virtue against him." But Machiavelli discovered something even more disturbing about this pattern. Because kind people were consistently being exploited and destroyed by their own virtue, they faced an impossible choice: remain kind and continue to be destroyed, or abandon kindness and become calculating like their exploiters. Machiavelli realized he was witnessing what he would later describe as the corruption of virtue by necessity, a process where good people were forced to abandon their natural compassion in order to survive in a world that punished goodness. Machiavelli wrote in his personal observations, "The tragedy of human society is not that evil men triumph over good, but that good men are systematically converted into calculating men by the very individuals who exploit their original kindness. Virtue destroys virtue through the mechanism of exploitation, leaving society populated by those who have learned that kindness is luxury they cannot afford." Therefore, Machiavelli began investigating what he would call the mechanics of virtue exploitation. He discovered that manipulative individuals didn't randomly encounter kind people. They actively sought them out with unconscious but systematic precision. Machiavelli wrote, "There exists a category of individuals whose entire approach to life is based on identifying and exploiting the kindness of others. They possess an instinctive ability to recognize generous hearts and vulnerable consciences, then systematically extract resources from these individuals while maintaining the illusion of gratitude and reciprocity." Modern research by Dr. Martha Stout on sociopathic behavior patterns validates Machiavelli's early observations about predatory individuals who specifically target kind-hearted people. Her studies show that manipulative personalities deliberately seek out empathetic and generous individuals because they provide ideal sources for exploitation. But Machiavelli identified something more specific and more dangerous within human social dynamics: the systematic destruction of virtue through the exploitation of virtuous impulses. Machiavelli observed that kind people who hadn't developed strategic awareness often fell victim to what he called virtue signaling manipulation. Exploitative individuals would present themselves as wounded, grateful, or morally aligned with the kind person's values, creating artificial intimacy and trust that could then be systematically exploited. Machiavelli wrote, "The predator of kindness does not approach with obvious malice, but rather with apparent vulnerability and need. They mirror the kind person's own moral values and concerns, creating the illusion of shared virtue while actually planning systematic extraction of resources and energy." Machiavelli identified 4 distinct types of predators that systematically destroy kind people. Type 1, the professional victim. Machiavelli documented individuals who formed relationships with kind people specifically to exploit their compassion through constant crisis and manufactured emergencies. These predators would always have overwhelming problems that required the kind person's immediate assistance and resources. Machiavelli wrote, "The professional victim has learned to weaponize suffering, creating artificial crises designed to activate the kind person's natural desire to help and protect. They do not seek solutions to their problems, but rather permanent sources of rescue and support. These individuals would monopolize the kind person's time and energy with dramatic personal emergencies that always seem to require urgent intervention. Most destructively, professional victims would escalate their crises whenever the kind person tried to establish boundaries or focus attention elsewhere. They had developed sophisticated abilities to sense when the kind person's attention was drifting and would create new emergencies that demanded immediate compassionate response. Type 2, the gratitude collector. Machiavelli identified predators who targeted kind people specifically to collect praise, validation, and emotional support while providing nothing in return. These individuals would present themselves as misunderstood or unappreciated, positioning the kind person as the only one who truly recognized their value. Machiavelli wrote, "The gratitude collector treats the kind person as a mirror designed solely to reflect their own self-image in the most flattering possible light. They extract validation and emotional resources while contributing nothing to the relationship except artificial appreciation. These predators would monopolize conversations by steering every topic back to themselves, show no genuine interest in the kind person's experiences, and become uncomfortable or dismissive when kindness wasn't flowing in their direction. Most insidiously, gratitude collectors would use the kind person's compassion against them by claiming that others were too selfish or cruel to appreciate them, making the kind person feel specially chosen while actually isolating them from potentially reciprocal relationships. Type 3, the resource extractor. Machiavelli documented the most obvious category of predators, individuals who formed relationships with kind people specifically for material and financial exploitation. These predators would sense the kind person's difficulty saying no and their natural generosity, then systematically exploit these qualities for practical gain. Machiavelli wrote, "The resource extractor understands that the kind person's moral nature can be weaponized against their practical judgment. They create situations where refusing assistance feels morally cruel, even when continued assistance enables destructive behavior. These predators would consistently request money, favors, and material assistance while providing elaborate moral justifications for why the kind person should help them. They would frame their requests in terms of moral obligation, claim special circumstances that made their need urgent, and express gratitude that made the kind person feel valuable while actually conditioning them to provide increasingly unreasonable levels of support. Type 4, the conscience manipulator. Machiavelli identified the most dangerous category of predators, individuals who formed relationships with kind people specifically to gain psychological control through guilt, shame, and moral manipulation. These predators would systematically undermine the kind person's confidence in their own moral judgment while positioning themselves as moral authorities. Machiavelli wrote, "The conscience manipulator recognizes that the kind person's desire to be good can be exploited for total psychological dominance. They do not merely extract resources, but reprogram the kind person's entire moral framework to serve the predator's interests. These individuals would gradually convince kind people that their natural boundaries were selfish, that their self-protection instincts were cruel, and that true goodness required unlimited self-sacrifice. Over time, they would systematically erode the kind person's ability to distinguish between genuine moral obligations and manipulative guilt, creating psychological dependency where the kind person became unable to make decisions without the predator's moral guidance. Understanding your specific vulnerability pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Machiavelli called strategic kindness development. But first, you need to understand why Machiavelli considered this insight so dangerous. Because Machiavelli observed the devastating long-term effects of virtue exploitation on kind individuals and society as a whole. Therefore, he concluded that unprotected kindness posed genuine dangers to both personal well-being and the survival of virtue in human civilization. Machiavelli identified 3 specific dangers that made this insight so threatening. Danger 1, the complete destruction of trust and goodness. Machiavelli wrote, "The kind person who has been systematically exploited often transforms into someone harder and more calculating than their original exploiters, having learned through bitter experience that kindness is punished while cruelty is rewarded. When kind people finally recognize they've been manipulated by those they tried to help, they often swing to the opposite extreme of trusting no one and showing compassion to none." Machiavelli observed that exploited kind people would develop cynical worldviews that prevented them from forming any authentic relationships or contributing their natural goodness to society. They would become hypervigilant about others' motives, assuming that all expressions of need were attempts at manipulation and all requests for help were potential exploitation. Most tragically, these formerly kind people would often reject genuine opportunities to help others who truly deserved compassion because their exploitation trauma had taught them to interpret all vulnerability as potential manipulation. Danger. 2. The corruption of virtue through forced adaptation. Machiavelli documented how systematic exploitation forced kind people to abandon their natural moral impulses in order to survive in social environments that punished goodness. After being repeatedly victimized, these individuals would learn to become calculating, manipulative, and strategically cruel as psychological self-protection. Machiavelli wrote, "Society loses its most valuable members not through their death, but through their corruption. The kind person who learns to be calculating in self-defense often becomes more ruthless than those who are naturally selfish, because they understand goodness well enough to exploit it effectively in others." These corrupted, formerly kind people would become skilled at identifying and manipulating the very virtues they once possessed, turning their understanding of kindness into weapons for their own advancement. They had been taught by cruel experience that virtue was weakness, generosity was stupidity, and trust was invitation for exploitation, making them perpetually dangerous to other kind people who hadn't yet learned these harsh lessons. Danger. 3. The elimination of virtue from society. Most dangerously, Machiavelli found that the systematic destruction of kind people created societies dominated by calculating individuals who had either naturally lacked compassion or had been forced to abandon it through exploitation. This created what he called virtue scarcity, environments where kindness became so rare and dangerous that it effectively disappeared from social interaction. Machiavelli wrote, "When kind people are consistently destroyed by their kindness, society eventually contains only those who have learned that virtue is liability." This creates communities where no one can afford to be genuinely good, resulting in collective moral degradation that makes authentic human connection impossible. These morally degraded societies would become dominated by individuals who viewed every interaction as potential competition, every relationship as opportunity for advantage, and every expression of kindness as either manipulation or foolishness. The absence of genuine virtue would create environments where trust became impossible, cooperation became strategic rather than authentic, and human relationships became entirely transactional. This is why Machiavelli considered the development of strategic kindness not just practically important, but socially urgent, because unprotected virtue posed such dangers to both individual survival and societal moral health. Therefore, Machiavelli developed what he called the protected virtue method, a systematic approach to maintaining genuine kindness while protecting it from systematic exploitation. Phase 1. Recognition of virtue exploitation patterns. Machiavelli taught that kind people must first recognize the specific ways their compassion was being systematically exploited by predatory individuals. He called this exploitation awareness, the ability to identify the predictable methods that manipulative people use to target and drain kind-hearted individuals. Machiavelli wrote, "The good person must learn to recognize that their repeated victimization is not the result of bad luck or poor judgment, but the consequence of predictable patterns that can be identified and defended against." Technique. Machiavelli instructed kind people to examine their relationship history and identify common patterns in how exploitative individuals approached them, what emotional buttons they pushed, and what methods they used to maintain access to compassionate resources. He taught them to recognize warning signs, excessive early intimacy designed to bypass natural caution, dramatic personal stories intended to activate compassion, requests for help that were never reciprocated, and attempts to isolate them from friends or family who might provide reality-checking perspective. Phase 2. Strategic kindness implementation. Machiavelli discovered that kind people who tried to protect themselves by completely abandoning compassion often became as destructive as their original exploiters. Instead, he taught what he called strategic virtue, maintaining genuine kindness, while developing sophisticated defenses against those who would exploit it. Machiavelli wrote, "The goal is not to abandon goodness, but to become good strategically rather than naively. The wise person maintains their compassionate nature while protecting it from those who would use it for destruction." Machiavelli instructed kind people to practice gradual trust building rather than immediate openness, reciprocity requirements in all relationships, and systematic evaluation of whether their kindness was inspiring gratitude or creating dependency. He emphasized that strategic kindness required learning to distinguish between people who deserved compassionate assistance and people who were seeking to exploit compassionate impulses for personal gain. Phase 3: Virtue protection and cultivation. The final phase involved what Machiavelli called protected goodness, actively seeking out and nurturing relationships with individuals capable of appreciating and reciprocating genuine kindness, while maintaining strong defenses against predatory individuals. Machiavelli wrote, "The strategically kind person must learn not just to avoid exploiters, but to find and cultivate relationships with others who understand the value of mutual virtue and reciprocal compassion." This required developing what Machiavelli called virtue discernment, the ability to distinguish between genuine moral character and performance of moral character designed to exploit kind impulses. Machiavelli taught kind people to look for others who demonstrated consistent ethical behavior rather than just speaking about moral values, who showed genuine interest in mutual well-being rather than only seeking personal benefit, and who could maintain their own moral standards without requiring constant validation or support from others. Because Machiavelli understood that the kindness-exploitation dynamic either destroyed good people or forced them to become calculating predators themselves. Therefore, he studied both successful and unsuccessful cases to understand what determined whether kind people learned strategic protection or were consumed by exploitation, the case of virtue destruction. Machiavelli documented numerous individuals whose natural kindness had been so thoroughly exploited that they became either completely withdrawn from human relationship or transformed into manipulative predators themselves. He wrote about merchants, political figures, and even religious leaders who had started as genuinely compassionate people but had been so systematically used and betrayed that they lost all capacity for authentic goodness. Machiavelli noted, "I have witnessed men of such original virtue and generosity that they seem touched by divine goodness, yet through repeated exploitation and betrayal, they became harder and more cruel than those who had never possessed virtue at all." These cases represented what Machiavelli saw as the complete failure of virtue protection, individuals whose kindness had been weaponized against them so effectively that they became enemies of the very goodness they had once embodied. The case of strategic virtue mastery. Machiavelli extensively studied individuals who had successfully learned to maintain genuine kindness while being completely protected from exploitation. He was particularly impressed by certain political and business leaders who could demonstrate authentic compassion while being absolutely immune to manipulation through their virtue. Machiavelli wrote about leaders who had developed what he called wise goodness, the ability to help others effectively while being completely protected from those who would exploit their helpful nature. These individuals could instantly identify genuine need versus manipulative requests, could provide assistance that genuinely helped without creating dependency, and could maintain their compassionate nature while being strategically invulnerable to virtue-based manipulation. Unlike kind people who became cynical, these strategically virtuous individuals maintained their capacity for deep compassion while being completely skilled at protecting their goodness from systematic exploitation. Machiavelli's own strategic development. Most significantly, Machiavelli documented his own transformation from naive idealism about human goodness to strategic virtue that maintained compassion while being protected from exploitation. Machiavelli wrote, "In my youth, I believed that treating others with honor and generosity would inspire reciprocal virtue. Experience taught me that such naive goodness merely identifies one as target for systematic exploitation by those who understand how to weaponize virtue against the virtuous." Machiavelli's breakthrough came when he realized that protecting his capacity for goodness required developing sophisticated understanding of human nature and strategic thinking about when and how to express virtue safely. He wrote, "I learned that true goodness requires wisdom about evil, and that maintaining virtue in a world full of vice demands strategic intelligence as much as moral intention." This realization transformed his approach to both personal relationships and political strategy, moving from naive virtue to strategic virtue that could survive and thrive in competitive environments. Because individuals with naturally kind dispositions often struggle to distinguish between people who deserve their compassion and people who seek to exploit it.
Wisdom can coexist
Therefore,
effectively.
Machiavelli emphasized the crucial importance of learning what he called virtue-worthy recognition, specific signs that distinguish genuine recipients from virtue predators. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, "The wise person must learn to distinguish between those who honor virtue and those who exploit it, between those who deserve trust and those who manipulate trust for personal advantage." Machiavelli identified 3 essential characteristics that indicate someone worthy of kind treatment. Characteristic 1, demonstrated reciprocity. Machiavelli wrote, "The person worthy of kindness consistently demonstrates their own capacity for virtue through actions rather than words. They do not merely receive goodness, but contribute goodness to relationships and communities." Worthy individuals would show genuine gratitude through their own helpful behavior, would offer assistance during others' difficult times, and would demonstrate consistent ethical behavior in their other relationships and commitments. Machiavelli observed that virtue-worthy people could appreciate kindness without taking it for granted, would respect boundaries and limitations, and would never attempt to manipulate others through guilt or emotional pressure. Characteristic 2, independent moral character. Machiavelli identified worthy individuals as those who maintained their own ethical standards and took responsibility for their own moral development rather than relying on others to provide constant moral guidance and support. Machiavelli wrote, "Those who deserve kindness possess their own inner compass for right and wrong. They do not require others to manage their conscience or make their moral decisions for them." Virtue-worthy people would demonstrate consistent ethical behavior even when it was difficult or costly, would take responsibility for their mistakes rather than blaming others, and would maintain their moral standards without requiring constant validation or approval. Characteristic 3, genuine concern for others' well-being. Machiavelli observed that people worthy of kindness showed authentic interest in others' welfare rather than viewing relationships as opportunities for personal benefit. While they might occasionally need assistance during genuine crises, their baseline approach to relationships involved mutual concern rather than one-sided extraction. Machiavelli wrote, "The person deserving of virtue demonstrates virtue in their treatment of others, showing through consistent behavior that they understand kindness as mutual exchange rather than unilateral exploitation." The recognition process. Machiavelli developed specific indicators for kind people to identify worthy versus exploitative individuals. Worthy people maintain consistent behavior across different contexts, rather than changing their character based on what they want to. Extract. They show genuine curiosity about others' experiences, rather than only seeking validation for their own perspectives. They demonstrate what Machiavelli called earned trust, proving their reliability through small commitments before seeking larger assistance or support. They can handle disappointment and rejection without becoming manipulative or vindictive. They offer practical help and emotional support, rather than only expecting others to provide these things for them. Gradual trust-building protocol. Machiavelli taught kind people a careful process for determining relationship worthiness. 1. Observe how they treat people who cannot benefit them in any way. 2. Notice whether they keep commitments and promises consistently over time. 3. Assess whether they take responsibility for their own problems rather than constantly seeking rescue. 4. Evaluate whether they show genuine appreciation rather than just performing gratitude to maintain access to assistance. 5. Determine whether they respect boundaries and limitations rather than constantly pushing for more help or support. Machiavelli emphasized, the goal is not to become suspicious of all human need, but to learn to distinguish between genuine virtue and performed virtue, between authentic difficulty and manufactured crisis. Because strategic kindness serves both individual protection and the preservation of virtue in society when practiced by good people, therefore Machiavelli viewed the development of protected virtue as essential not just for personal survival, but for maintaining the possibility of authentic goodness in human civilization. Machiavelli wrote in Discourses on Livy, "The person who learns to be good strategically rather than naively serves not only their own interests, but the interests of virtue itself, demonstrating that goodness can survive and thrive even in environments designed to exploit it." He believed that kind people who successfully develop strategic virtue become what he called virtue protectors. Individuals who help preserve authentic goodness by demonstrating that compassion and wisdom can coexist effectively. The 4 stages of strategic virtue development. Stage 1, exploitation recognition without virtue abandonment. The first transformation occurs when kind people learn to recognize they've been exploited without concluding that kindness itself is wrong or foolish. Machiavelli called this wise disillusionment, understanding that being targeted by predators was the result of their virtue rather than evidence that virtue was worthless. Machiavelli wrote, "The beginning of strategic virtue is recognizing that your kindness attracted predators not because kindness is wrong, but because predators specifically target virtue for exploitation." Stage 2, strategic protection without cynical hardening. The second stage involves learning to protect kind impulses while maintaining genuine capacity for compassion and generosity. Machiavelli called this protected goodness, developing sophisticated defenses while preserving the ability to express authentic virtue when appropriate. Machiavelli observed, "The strategically kind person learns not to be less good, but to be good more intelligently, maintaining compassionate impulses, while developing predator-proof boundaries." Stage 3, virtue cultivation without naive vulnerability. The third transformation happens when kind people learn to actively seek out and nurture relationships with others capable of appreciating and reciprocating authentic goodness. Machiavelli called this conscious virtue partnership, using wisdom to identify and cultivate relationships with people worthy of trust and compassion. Machiavelli wrote, "The privilege of strategic virtue is learning to use your kindness not randomly, but purposefully, directing your goodness toward those who honor it rather than those who would exploit it." Stage 4, virtue leadership without preaching. The final stage involves what Machiavelli called virtue demonstration, inspiring others to maintain their own goodness through example rather than through moral lecturing or superior attitudes about strategic development. Machiavelli observed, "The fully developed strategic person inspires virtue in others, not through preaching about exploitation, but through demonstrating that goodness can be both authentic and invulnerable when practiced with wisdom." The protection becomes social preservation. Machiavelli believed that kind people who successfully develop strategic virtue serve a vital protective function for virtue itself within human society. They prove that goodness can survive in competitive environments, demonstrate that compassion and intelligence can coexist, and create safe spaces where other kind people can maintain their virtue without being destroyed. Machiavelli wrote, "What is not protected in human nature becomes extinct in human society." Strategic virtue carriers help preserve the possibility of authentic goodness by proving that virtue can be both genuine and invulnerable when practiced with wisdom. But Machiavelli warned about specific pitfalls that can derail strategic virtue development. Because the path of protecting kindness contains specific dangers, therefore Machiavelli documented the most common ways kind people sabotage their own strategic development. Pitfall 1. The cynical overcorrection. Machiavelli wrote extensively about kind people who became so focused on avoiding exploitation that they rejected all opportunities for genuine virtue and authentic relationship. In The Prince, he warned, "The danger is that the exploited good person becomes so suspicious of others' motives that they cannot recognize or respond to authentic need when it appears." Kind people who had been severely exploited often developed what Machiavelli called virtue paranoia, interpreting every request for help as potential manipulation and every expression of gratitude as performance designed for continued exploitation. Machiavelli observed, "The moment a kind person believes all human need is manipulation, they have allowed their exploiters to destroy not just their past relationships, but their future capacity for authentic virtue." Pitfall 2. The superiority. Complex development. Machiavelli documented cases where kind people who learned strategic protection became arrogant about their ability to see through others, developing condescending attitudes toward people who hadn't yet learned these defensive skills. Machiavelli wrote, "Strategic virtue requires humility about one's own previous vulnerability, not pride about current invulnerability to manipulation." These individuals would become judgmental about others' kindness choices, preachy about relationship red flags, and superior toward people who were still learning to protect their virtue. Pitfall 3. The strategic manipulation adoption. Machiavelli observed that some kind people who learned to protect themselves would begin using manipulative tactics themselves, justifying their behavior as necessary self-defense against a cruel world. They would become skilled at identifying and exploiting others' virtuous impulses, convincing themselves that everyone was manipulative, so their own manipulation was acceptable. Machiavelli warned, "When strategic protection becomes strategic exploitation, the person has not preserved their virtue, but has abandoned it entirely." Pitfall 4. The isolated righteousness. Even successfully strategic kind people could regress into using their protective abilities to justify complete withdrawal from human connection during periods of disappointment or stress. They would convince themselves that maintaining virtue required avoiding all potentially exploitative relationships, which Machiavelli recognized as fear disguised as wisdom. Machiavelli emphasized, "Strategy is meant to help good people engage safely with the world, not to justify avoiding engagement entirely." The strategic maintenance. Machiavelli developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy, strategic virtue. Regular assessment of whether relationships involve mutual benefit or one-sided extraction. Conscious attention to whether assistance is enabling growth or creating dependency in others. Ongoing boundary practice to prevent regression into naive availability or cynical withdrawal. Connection with other strategically virtuous people who understand the challenges of maintaining protected goodness. Regular evaluation of whether strategic behavior is preserving virtue or corrupting it. Machiavelli wrote, "The strategically virtuous person does not achieve perfect invulnerability, but learns to navigate human relationships with wisdom that preserves their capacity for authentic goodness while protecting it from systematic exploitation." Because Machiavelli understood virtue exploitation within the context of broader social and political dynamics, therefore he viewed people who developed strategic virtue as serving an essential protective function for human civilization itself. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, "The person who learns to be good strategically serves not only their own survival, but the preservation of virtue as possibility within human society." He believed that individuals with protected virtue serve as what he called virtue preservers, people whose strategic goodness proves that authentic compassion can survive and thrive even in environments designed to exploit it. The historical pattern. Machiavelli observed that throughout history, societies that systematically destroyed their kind, people through exploitation, became morally degraded communities dominated by calculating individuals who had learned that virtue was liability. Machiavelli wrote, "What appears in the strategically virtuous person first as personal protection later manifests in society as improved moral standards, reduced tolerance for virtue exploitation, and better recognition of authentic versus manipulative goodness." Modern manifestations. Machiavelli believed that in any era, people with strategic virtue might be modeling relationship patterns that explain authentic versus exploitative requests for help, healthy boundaries that protect virtue without abandoning it, recognition of genuine need versus manufactured crisis, and the difference between earned trust and naive trust. Machiavelli's insight: the kind person who learns strategic protection feels the need for virtue preservation first and most intensely. Their personal development often demonstrates what entire societies need to learn about maintaining goodness in environments where goodness is targeted for exploitation. The service without sacrifice. Machiavelli's crucial insight was that virtue serves human civilization best when it's protected through strategic wisdom rather than destroyed through naive availability. The goal isn't to abandon kindness to survive in a cruel world, but to become wise about how to express kindness safely and effectively. Machiavelli wrote, "The person serves human goodness not by sacrificing themselves to exploiters, but by demonstrating that authentic virtue can be both genuine and invulnerable when practiced with intelligence and strategic awareness." The ultimate strategy. At the highest level of development, Machiavelli observed that people learn to use their virtue as both a gift and a weapon, offering genuine kindness to those who deserve it while being completely protected from those who would exploit it, maintaining authentic compassion while being strategically invulnerable to manipulation, and preserving their goodness while being absolutely capable of defending it against predatory individuals. Machiavelli called this sovereign virtue, the ability to serve human goodness naturally through strategic demonstration of protected virtue without preaching about exploitation or withdrawing from human connection entirely. Remember Machiavelli's observation of the good man's inevitable destruction through studying those who learned strategic virtue
to help preserve
versus those
authentic
who were
goodness by
consumed
demonstrating that
exploitation.
compassion and wisdom can
Machiavelli
coexist
discovered that
effectively.
transformation was possible Those who learned strategic protection maintained their genuine kindness while becoming completely immune to virtue-based manipulation. They found relationships with people who appreciated their goodness without exploiting it for personal benefit. They learned to help others effectively without creating dependency or enabling dysfunction. Most importantly, they stopped viewing their kindness as a liability and began understanding it as Machiavelli called a powerful asset that requires strategic deployment to remain effective and sustainable. Machiavelli wrote about this transformation. The strategically virtuous person learns not to be less kind, but to be kind more wisely, not to trust less, but to trust more strategically. Their virtue remains intact, but their relationship to virtue becomes protected rather than vulnerable to systematic exploitation. This represents Machiavelli's most dangerous insight about kindness, that unprotected virtue, in a world full of calculating individuals, will be systematically exploited until kind people either become broken victims or transform into calculating predators themselves. And this exploitation will either destroy your faith in human goodness completely or force you to develop exactly the strategic wisdom that preserves virtue while protecting it from systematic destruction. Your natural kindness isn't a weakness that makes you vulnerable to exploitation. It's a valuable trait that predatory individuals target specifically because they recognize its power and desirability. You're not naive for trusting people who manipulated your virtue. You were targeted by individuals who specialize in exploiting goodness because they cannot generate it themselves. The question isn't whether you should abandon kindness to survive in a calculating world. The question is whether you'll develop the strategic wisdom necessary to protect your virtue while remaining genuinely compassionate toward those who deserve it. Machiavelli's protected virtue method offers a path from naive goodness to strategic goodness, from virtue victimization to virtue sovereignty, from exploited kindness to invulnerable compassion. You were born to be good, not to be exploited unconsciously, but to serve human virtue through demonstrating that goodness can be both authentic and strategically protected. The world needs your kindness, but it needs it protected through wisdom that transforms vulnerability into strength. Your virtue is not your weakness. Your lack of strategic protection for your virtue is your vulnerability. Learn to protect your goodness consciously, and you become exactly what Machiavelli believed strategic virtue carriers were meant to be, guardians of authentic human goodness in a world that would otherwise destroy it through systematic exploitation. Machiavelli's most dangerous insight about kindness wasn't that it makes people vulnerable. It's that most kind people never learn to protect their virtues strategically, remaining targets for exploitation throughout their lives until their goodness is either destroyed or corrupted into calculating manipulation. The danger isn't in being naturally kind. It's in failing to develop the strategic wisdom that transforms virtue from liability into invulnerable asset. You are not too good for this world. You are exactly what human civilization requires. Once you learn to protect your virtue as strategically as Machiavelli learned to protect his insights, if you recognize yourself in Machiavelli's description of the naturally kind person who attracts exploitation, you're part of a valuable group that civilization depends on for moral preservation. Share in the comments what type of virtue exploitation you've experienced. Your strategic development connects with others, learning to protect their goodness while maintaining their capacity for authentic compassion. Subscribe for more insights into strategic wisdom about human nature and relationship dynamics that transcend conventional understanding of virtue and social interaction. If you're ready to explore more strategic insights about protecting valuable, traits in competitive environments, check out my video on Machiavelli's most dangerous discovery about trust, where I reveal the specific methods for maintaining authentic relationships while being completely protected from betrayal and manipulation. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.